What is going on, my fellow makers? Matt from Keep Making. Today I'm going to show you how I made this ginormous board. Let's get to it.
Shall we begin?
Now, I have built a Weathertop piece before, but when I did, I was mostly going for aesthetic. I love the way this piece looks, it's just not very playable. You'll see here in some of this footage, models just can't really find purchase on it. When you're climbing up the hill, if it takes more than one turn or one round of combat to get up there, it's really hard to place your model somewhere without jamming it into the surface. So I want a new version of this piece, and that's where this project started. So to do so, I go to the original creators page here on Thingiverse, and I'll put the link in the description below. But really what I'm looking for is a remix where somebody has already graciously separated this into 4 separate files, and I actually needed to make a 5th file because I'm going to print this at 275% its original scale. So this is going to be pretty big. Okay, so I have all the pieces printed off now. But because I printed on such low infill and had some extruder issues while printing, some of these pieces have come out pretty frail. This one specifically, these are kind of falling off. So my plan is to compensate for the low infill is to give everything a coat of polyurethane when it's all assembled. But until then, we still want some rigidity while I'm working on it, getting it ready for priming and stuff like that. So what I'm gonna do is use a lot of super glue in some of these weaker pieces. Like this one you can see is bending a bit. So I'm just gonna use some liquid super glue, apply that over top. Oh, see, there we go. We got some cracking going on here. That's some low extrusion going on here, but hopefully I won't have to spend another 12 hours printing this piece. I can solidify it with some liquid super glue and some polyurethane, and it should be good to go. So we'll get into that now. For these bigger pieces that are chunking off here, just a layer of super glue around this part. Now it's going to obscure some details, so if you're ever working on something where you want that outer edge to be super clean, you know, you might be better off just reprinting. For this though, this is a giant stone ruin, and so we're going to be texturing this up a lot anyways, so not really an issue for me. So I'm just going to go about here. That was just regular super glue, and I'll just show you what I mean with the liquid super glue. Now this is not an intricate process. I'm simply tilting this thing, seeing the weak areas, and dumping a bunch of super glue, not letting it pool up too much, so you can keep as much detail as possible, and just dripping that all over, letting it really seal in there. Give it a shot of activator. Watch some of it bubble up. It's actually going to add some nice texture, and we get a little bit more rigidity. We'll just keep on doing that on these weaker areas here. Okay, now that we got everything holding its shape more or less, it's time to combine these pieces. I'm just going to go one by one and hope for the best here. That seems to be the best approach. Let's fix this in the process too.
Wow!
Then I'm gonna melt off all of the print artifacts. We call it stringing. It's kind of like hot glue gun, all the strings it leaves behind. And then once that's done, I'm gonna go in with some spackling. I'm gonna try to fill all of the gaps or all the print lines to give us a more solid surface, and then add some texture by stippling some of the spackling as well. So it was at this point that I realized I wanted more than just the Weathertop piece. I wanted to make a full board. I've never tried a board this big before. If you've seen the other videos on my channel, you'll see I've tried some smaller boards, but I thought I'd try my hand at making a full-size wargaming board, and so I had to drop a plan. So this was my original sketch, and I know it's awful, so bear with me here. But on the right hand side, we have the old Weathertop piece that you just saw on camera there. And then on the left side, we have the new one that I'm currently working on. So I decided I was going to make this not a terrain piece, but a board. And so it was going to be a smaller, like Warcry size board where it had these two things, and it was about, you know, navigating through both of these hills and the bridge network that would connect them. But in doing so, I decided why not just go for a huge full-size wargaming board. We usually play with 4 people, so why not make it as big as possible? So stayed with that same structure from the first sketch. This would eventually change, but the river in the middle was the big add, and then having some ruined pieces on the side on the right. So I bought some supplies from the department store and began cutting out just a simple frame for the board to fit into. So once the frame had been completed, I can go about printing all of the ruined pieces I want to have on the board. So all of these links will be in the description. From Dark Realms, I'm using that ruined building. From RM Printable, I'm going to be using this bridge as well as the chapel piece they have. From Terrainify, I'm going to be using both their Temple Wall A and B sets. These are great for cover and stuff like that, and they looked awesome by the end of this. Then for the Weathertop side of things, I'm going to use these stairs from Tabletop Minis, as well as some of these Crypta Studios Raven hold ruins to go into the walls. And then from the Printing Goes Ever On, I'm going to be using this circular sort of staircase, and this is free.
Behold my stuff.
So I'm going to start assembling all the printed pieces once they finally finish printing. And I'm just doing this with a little bit of super glue. Now for the Dark Realms piece, I wanted to have the interiors playable as well. I didn't do it on the left side, but on this right side of the building, I really wanted to make sure that area was still playable. So I used a countersink bit and just drilled straight into the 3D print, leaving enough room that I could slot a magnet into either side. That way this piece will be removable and we can play inside and outside the building.
Towards the other at full speed. Gideon braced himself and applied a spell to keep him pressed against Ilago's neck.
Now once everything's assembled, I'm using this drywall compound or spackling to fill in some of the print lines of these pieces, as well as add some texture by stippling this with an old brush. Okay, so we have all our pieces printed, we have our board made, needs a little bit of cleanup, but so far everything is looking fine. I'm not quite sure if this is how it's going to stay. I think we're ready to move forward with priming these pieces. So I'm going to take these outside to prime them. It is minus 30 today, Celsius that is, so that might prove an obstacle, but we're going to take them out to get them primed. And then while those are drying, I am going to clean up the edge of this board here where some of this polyurethane is spilled out, and the board I cut a little bit too long here. So we'll go do those things and then we'll move on to actually starting to build the board.
Now getting this edge clean took a lot longer than I thought it would. I had to use a variety of different sawing implements as well as my Dremel tool to actually get it clean, and then I'll sand it when I'm done cutting the edge off. Now once that edge is cleaned up, I'm going to go inside the edge of the board and I'm going to use some 5-minute epoxy. Because the river's going in here, I know that I don't want to have any resin leaks. I'm terrified of them. They've ruined projects for me in the past, and so where I know that river is going to be, I'm going to seal the edge of this just to make sure nothing can leak through there. Once the river's edge has been sealed, I can go in with some styrofoam. This is just some EPS styrofoam, the cheap stuff, and I'm just applying it with some hot glue. You could use some polyurethane foam, but hot glue is going to work fine enough for me. And this is going to make up the ground base, I guess, of our whole piece here.
Okay, we got the styrofoam in. Now I'm going to cut a hole. I realized I really didn't need to make a middle line for this board. You see there's two pieces, they don't exactly fill out the entirety of the board, so I had to put a little middle one, but I'm realizing now I probably could have went without it. So I'm going to pull it back up because this bridge has to be a little bit lower because it sits on these platforms here, and so I would have to have a platform coming out of the water anyways, which would make having a river kind of useless. So we're going to pull that out and then sink the river in. So this, there'll be a sort of like a path that comes down here, bang, and yeah.
So I begin just taking chunks out of that middle seam there and cutting the area to shape so that these bridge pieces can fit within it. Once I have those bridge pieces in, I can start marking out where I want the river to actually be, and then I'll start taking away this foam as well and digging down to the base layer. Now I can have my primed pieces out on the board and just lay out everything where I think I want it to go. This does end up being the final layout, as you'll see later on. And what I'm going to do is trace out all these places because I know where these buildings are going to sit. I don't actually need to put modeling compound to do the cobblestone. Now speaking of the modeling compound, I'm going to be using some Sculptamold. I'm going to be laying this out, rolling it flat with a rolling pin, and then I'm going to be using a texture roller from Green Stuff World, specifically the cobblestone one, to give me that cobblestone texture. Now I usually do this with like clay, but because of the size of this board and because I want it to be playable, I need it to be rigid, so I felt as though modeling compound would make the best product to use. I left the modeling compound overnight to dry, but while that's drying, I'm going to be casting up a boatload of casting plaster into these Woodland Scenics rock molds. So I have all my ground formations, my riverbed, any place that needs rocks on this board, I need to cast up a fresh set of rocks. So I think all in all, I probably did 20 pours. Moving on to the river now, I want to cut these flat so that the rocks can adhere to them as easily as possible, and then I'll just be using my glue gun for the time being to stick the rocks in place against the styrofoam, trim them back where they need to be trimmed, and just line this whole riverbed. once the sculptor mold is dried and all of the hot glue is done adhering all the rocks, I can start gluing all of the printed pieces into place. Now, one of the discoveries I made while doing this board is using this casting plaster to fill gaps, specifically with the rocks. So I was very paranoid about the resin leaking, like I mentioned earlier, so I poured between all of the seams in the rocks just so that no resin could actually get through these rocks. And I used the same material as I did to cast the rocks in the first place. That actually made me discover that by using a stippled brush and applying it like so, I could create a texture between the rocks that made it just look like it was a sheer rock face, which is what you want. Usually I would use like modeling compound to do this, and it doesn't always work out that way. And this casting plaster is a great adhesive, so I can apply my rocks directly into it and then give it the texture that I need. And lastly, I'm going to use some spare foam just to fill in the gaps in the bridge. That way I can save on some of the rock molds I've been casting and fill this up with plaster. It'll give it the texture we want and make sure I get no resin leaks. So now that the river has the rocks and is sealed, I can start actually creating the Weathertop piece.
Okay, so now I gotta figure out how I'm going to do this. Height isn't the main thing I'm concerned about. The higher the cooler, I think, but in terms of actual gameplay, you know, if it's taking multiple rounds or turns even to get down from here and get across, that's less cool in my opinion. Let's get to the action. So what I'm thinking is to utilize some of this space. You know, there could be some ruins over here, that's an option too, but I think I'll just sketch out, like I want there to sort of be where you have to come detour this way before going back around. So if the path is kind of like this before it goes back up. Now that may mean there's some elevation here. Let's say that's a stairs here and then a stair here that go back up. That's an option. I don't really know how that looks, so you know, stairs here, let's say, you know, these could be cut in as close as, well, we'd have to utilize one of these doors to make it, you know, make sense. So I don't know which one we would do. And then, you know, a stair here or something. I'd have the path that kind of goes up that way, but this, that's too close quarters for me to make sense, you know? So maybe it's something more like this coming this way and going up here, and then there's a path that kind of goes straight across here and then a stair here. I don't know what we're gonna do here. We'll figure it out. Okay, so this is what we got so far. There's a big chunk of styrofoam there. It's gonna lead up to that staircase, which will lead up to the Weathertop, and then a path that'll lead over to this staircase. I've decided that I'm just gonna wing it, see what happens. If we got to get more casting plaster to get more rock molds going, we'll do so. I'm going to get a bunch of barbecue skewers, skewer all this foam together, glue it in place, and we'll just start gluing things down and just gonna wing it. You know, that's what we do here. So I think we're gonna have to make some cuts into this, obviously lose that rectangular form. You know, it's not gonna be exactly how I dreamed it up, but it's gonna be mine, and that's what we're going for. It's the big table build. Let's go.
So at this point, I don't really go in with the plan. I'm just cutting up styrofoam as I see fit. Gluing the stairs in place was a good starting off point, and then I'm going to create a little cave, the tunnel kind of thing that goes underneath here. So I just cut those shapes into the styrofoam, start skewering it and hot gluing it in, and then I'm just building upon this, seeing where things can fit, filling in any cavities that I'll cover with rocks later on, and then gluing any of these extra scatter terrain bits. This one in the corner changes a bit later on, but once I've done all that, I can glue all of this Weathertop piece onto this board, and then we can begin carving out what we actually want this side to look like. while I was in bed looking at pictures of what I had done, I decided that I wanted this underpiece to actually be another tunnel. So I just cut it out of the styrofoam on either side. I can put rocks there, and then I'll have to cut these side pieces at an angle later on. Once I had all the styrofoam forms blocked out where I wanted them, I could start putting in some of the rocks that I've casted. Now, like I mentioned before, in the riverbed, I'm going to use some more casting plaster to fill any gaps between the rocks here, and then stippling it in with an old brush will give it that rock texture, so everything will share the same texture, same material. That way when we go to paint it, everything will be cohesive. Once I've textured all those bare surfaces, I can now come in with some more Sculptamold to give a ground formation to anywhere that's not getting the rock treatment. So that'll include everything on the Weathertop side, just to give that dirt, and then we're sculpting that into the rocks to give a natural sort of ground formation and texture. Now, to give a rock texture to some of the areas that wouldn't be easy to put rock molds into, I'm going to use some more casting plaster, but this time I'm going to use a ripped up sponge to dab on the texture. So on this edge, so that this doesn't look like a floating pile of dirt, and then on the inside on the tunnel where it'd be tougher to get those rocks in, I do that as well. Once we've got all our rocky surfaces taken care of, we can use some glue and just start going over all of that Sculptamold, all of that ground formation, and now we're going to add our texture. So go over with some watered down, just PVA glue, and then I'm going to go in with some tile grout over top of that. To seal the tile grout, I spray it down with some 50% isopropyl alcohol, and then I'm going to go in with some watered down Mod Podge and just spray it all over. That way everything will dry very solid, very hard, and then give us that texture we need too. And before I do the same on the city side, I'll just hot glue all of the pieces into place and then start putting down the tile grout. Now I'm going to add some rubble just to blend the seams where these 3D printed pieces meet the actual cobblestone or the rest of the board. So I'm mixing a bunch of different grits together. These are just rocks I got from the dollar store as well as some tile grout. Just going to go in straight with some PVA, and I'm also using these tiled pieces are just casting plaster just on a flat sheet and then break it into tiny pieces. So I go in with that first, and then I'll sprinkle all of that sort of different types of grit over top of it. Then I'm going to come in again with isopropyl alcohol as well as the watered down Mod Podge just to seal everything in place. That way when we go to paint it, this rubble's not going everywhere. Texture the river, I'm actually just going to mix up some water, some PVA glue, and a bunch of tile grout. Just going to mix this up completely, and then I'm just spreading it like a paste into the riverbed. With the ground textures out of the way, I'm going to start priming some of these pieces I didn't have a chance to earlier, so I'm just going to use a brush on primer. Once everything's primed, we can finally begin the painting process. So this is a perfect time to run out of my favorite gray base tone. So I'd have to go to the store and get some more. But for the time being, I'm using this neutral gray. We're going over all the stone details, all of the building. Anything made of stone is getting the same base coat of gray. Similarly, all of the ground textures are going to get this base coat of burnt umber. The riverbed is going to get a tan coat. And then I use some model paint to do all the wood details. This is a brown beige from Vallejo. And likewise, all of the tiles get another model paint, which is the Cavalry Brown from Vallejo. Now that everything's base coated, I'm going to start on to the wash phase. So this is using a watered down paint to add some detail to the recesses or some color to the recesses. So I'm going to be using some some thinned down oil paints. Do not use water, use an oil paint thinner. I thin it out a lot, as you can see in the cup I'm using here, and using this brown, this yellow ochre, and the green color, I'm going to apply kind of like a leopard spotting technique. So this is going to look a little bit ridiculous at first, but trust me, in the end, it's going to all work out. Yeah, like I said, it looks ridiculous, looks like a bad camo print, but just hang with me here, and we're going to go in with a black wash afterwards. This is going to take the majority of the detail, really get into those recesses, and then it's going to give us some unity in the tone of the piece. So everything gets the black wash, whereas only select areas are getting that yellow, green, and brown wash, and it'll mix sort of all of these colors together, tone them down, and give us that extra detail to get the gray to pop. After that first layer of the wash is dried, I'm going to go in with a lighter gray, and I'm doing a dry brush. So I'm getting most of the paint off the brush, just wiping it across a piece and hitting the highest details. Now, I wasn't really loving how this was turning out because that black oil wash, the thinner in it was reactivating the lower layers of wash I had applied. So to get around this, I'm going to use some matte spray from Krylon. This will seal everything in, and now I'll apply another black wash, which will be finally getting everything down to the same type of tone. Now once we've got that stone looking the way we want with that second wash, I can start dry brushing some of the ground formation. To do this, I'm using a cashmere tan kind of paint and going over all of that grout, really making that detail pop and adding that dimensionality to the piece. Once that's completed, I can start applying the foliage. So what I'm going to do is spread out this PVA glue. It's a little bit watered down here just to get some more distance out of it, and then I'm going to go in with a coarse dark green, and I'm going to put that more towards the middle of these grass patches, and then I'm going to come over that with like burnt grass color and apply that all over the patch. So it's going to go even over that coarse stuff, but once we get the IPA on there and then lock it in with some Mod Podge the same way we did with the tile grout, it's going to really look natural and cohesive. Then in the riverbed, I'm going to use some clump foliage to do some, like, simulate some like seaweeds or like underwater bushes, I guess. I don't know what they're called. But yeah, I'm going to do the same thing here, and then I'm going to come in with a coarse light this time. That's going to be sort of like the algae and stuff. And then again, we're coming in with a fine just to give a little bit more detail. Then the very edges of the river are going to get a black, the same black that I'll end up painting the trim of this basin, just to hide any sort of wood grain or anything. Now we can move on to pouring the river. So mixing up a 2-part epoxy, using this caramel and this peacock blue resin dyes. Now if I was doing this again, I would just use some acrylic paint. Some people would advise against using acrylic paint in your resins, but I've had way more success with those than I had with this. I was actually mixing this while it was poured into the board to try to get the color more to what I wanted, but just couldn't get there. So I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But I mixed this 2-part epoxy up. I'm just using an old, I think this is a ginger ale bottle, to mix everything in because I didn't want to ruin, a useful bottle that I had. So I'm just using this extra one, and we'll get going here. Once everything is mixed, I can start pouring the epoxy. I didn't mix it as well as I probably should have, which you can see at the end here, but I just start pouring in one place, knowing that it'll find its level on the other side. I, at some point, realized I didn't love the brown on the other side of the board, so I went over it with the same gray base coat that everyone else got, or everything else got, I should say, and then I'm going to hit it with a black wash later on. Now, like I do on all my boards or all my minis or anything, I'm going to use just a black trim to coat the base rim. Now, before we get into the final glamour shots here, just want to give you an update on the channel. I am trying to have at least one video come out a month, if not more. But if you'd like to support me in trying to achieve that, you can subscribe to my Patreon, where I have multiple tiers there. And you can find all the details on my Patreon page. I'll leave the link in the description below. Follow me on Instagram, keep_making. You can see stuff that doesn't get covered in videos. A lot of the war bands or armies I'm painting don't get covered in full videos just because I don't have the time currently. So if you'd like to see those videos, let me know. And if you'd like to support me in making those videos, subscribe to the Patreon. Without any further ado, let's get into these final reveals.
Shall we begin?
you have it. That is the big gaming board. There are some things I would still like to add. I'm not sure when I'll get a chance to do that. Obviously, the river color didn't turn out quite the way I wanted it to, so I think the first of things I might try to tackle again for this board is putting more of a brown, thinner layer of epoxy over this one. Still get some of that transparency, and I do like how this looks. It's just, it's not really what I want. But then after that, I will go in and put some water texture on top of this, so it's not completely transparent and you can see a little bit of which direction the river is flowing. And then there are some other things like, you know, sidewalk structures and stuff like that that I'd like to have in there, just because this all kind of blends into one surface with different textures on it. So I'd like to add some raised areas just to differentiate where the cobblestone starts and where that padding is sort of drawn out. So those are things I might be adding. I might make videos of that, but we'll see. Like I was saying before, subscribe to my Patreon if you feel like supporting this channel. Make sure you're subscribed to my YouTube channel, hitting that bell so you know when these videos do release, and follow me on Instagram at keep_making so you can see all the things I'm painting, all the fun projects I'm tackling that don't get their own video. So whether you're tackling a single piece, a big board with a river or a lake in, make sure you keep making.